Hi everyone, my name is Daphne and I'm a member of the San Francisco chapter of FAPA YPG. FAPA, that stands for the Formosan Association for Public Affairs Young Professionals Group. And I believe that we have a couple of members from the World Affairs Council Young Professionals Group here too, so that's interesting. I think today I would like to start with opening remarks from Ms. Yaomei Li, who is the president for the Northern California FAPA. And Ms. Li, if you could please step up and give us a few words. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, good afternoon. My name is Yaomei. I am the current president of Formosan Association for Public Affairs of Northern California chapter. FAPA, FAPA, as we call it, is a non-profit organization. We dedicate, the organization dedicated to the issues of Taiwan's democracy and self-determination. If you have more questions about the organization, I will be very happy to talk to you later. And thank you for coming this afternoon. And I hope you will enjoy our conference later. Thank you again.
Next, we'd like to ask our co-sponsor, that's the World Affairs Council Peninsula chapter. We have Mr. Rolf Kuiper, who's the president of the organization. We'd like to ask him to step up and tell us a little bit about his organization and just give a few words. Thank you, Mr. Kuiper.
Well, greetings, and it's a pleasure for our chapter to be able to help co-sponsor the event today. And we did something similar to this about 2 or 3 years ago now. I've forgotten exactly when it was. And I just want to mention a little bit about the World Affairs Council. We also are a non-partisan organization that is dedicated to involving and informing the public in matters of national and international concern. And I would invite you to go to the website for the Northern California chapter, and it is www.itsyourworld.org. I'm the chairperson of the Peninsula chapter, and there are 3 other chapters in the Bay Area, one in Sacramento, one in the East Bay, and one in Marin. So if you happen to be in those areas, you can probably find a chapter event there. We do like one a month here. In the San Francisco main office, there's like 2 or 3 a week. Again, there's a lot of things that we do. I might just mention from a personal point of view, I had the pleasure of visiting Taiwan. It's been, just remembering, it's been over 20 years ago now, just over 20. And one of my daughters was at Stanford at the time, and she was teaching English in Chiayi, which is, some of you apparently know where that is. That's good. So we visited her for about a week in Taiwan. We just found it an amazing country. We went to one of her classes, and the students, all young people, knew far more about U.S. politics than we did about Taiwan. So that was an educational experience in itself. But it was a wonderful country, and I'm sure we took a bus from Chiayi back to Taipei to catch the airplane. And there was a lot of open country at the time. And somebody was just mentioned to me, you need to visit again, because I suspect a lot of it's filled in sort of like our freeways have in the United States. So, at any rate, thanks very much for this opportunity, and I hope it's a good session this afternoon. Look forward to seeing you. Thank you.
Our last co-sponsor is Hillary, well, not Hillary herself, but the TCS, Stanford TCS, that's a Taiwanese Cultural Society. Is Hillary here?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Can you tell us a little bit about TCS?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hillary Lin, and I'm the liaison for Taiwanese Culture Society, aka TCS. And we're the organization that brings Taiwanese culture to the Stanford community through our events like Night Market and Taste of Taiwan. And at these events, we give out Taiwanese food to people and try to educate them a little bit about Taiwan. And we're glad to welcome you here today. Thank you.
Actually, we have one more co-sponsor who's not up on the slide here, but it's the SKB Foundation. She's declined to make remarks, but we want to thank the SKB as well. Now, finally, we've had our speakers. You can go home. No, just kidding. We'll start with our first speaker, who is Dr. Garrit van der Wies, or I prefer to call him Dr. Gerald van der Wies, as you say it in Dutch. I want to just say a little bit about Dr. van der Wies. He is the senior political advisor to FAPA. He works at the FAPA national headquarters in Washington, D.C., and he works a lot with think tanks, with congressmen and media organizations, and he's actually probably more renowned for being the founder and editor of the Taiwan Communique, which is a bi-monthly publication, international publication, devoted to human rights and democracy in Taiwan. And this publication is about almost 30 years old, I believe. It started out in 1980 when leading political opposition figures, democratic opposition figures in Taiwan were jailed, and I think that probably spurred on the founding of the publication, and he's done a lot of great things for the people of Taiwan. Thank you.
Daphne. It's really a great honor to be here and to be here among so many good friends. We'd really like to thank in the first place Yame for organizing the event together with other organizations. I think it's really great to get other groups involved, and Mr. Kuiper, who is of course also a Dutchman, is from the World Affairs Council, and they are really doing great work also. And also thanks very much for co-sponsoring it. It's an honor to be here and to see so many of the young people. I think that's important. We ourselves, my wife Mei Jin, is here, and we ourselves got involved more than 30 years ago, and we are kind of the older generation already. So it's great to see a new young generation present here. The official title is officially unofficial, and that requires a little bit of an explanation, because official refers to the Taiwan Relations Act itself, which is an official US law, and it determines how relations, the unofficial relations with Taiwan, are regulated between the United States and Taiwan. We'll have three speakers today, and just the names again and the titles. I will talk mainly about how the Taiwan Relations Act came about and how it was implemented in the first 10 years or so, especially with regard to human rights in Taiwan. There's an important human rights clause in the Taiwan Relations Act, which is sometimes not paid too much attention to, but it's important. Then Professor Teufel Dreyer will pick up where I leave off, basically in the early 90s, and talk about the rise of China, US commitments to Taiwan in terms of the security of Taiwan, also very important from early 90s until basically the present. And then Steve Yates will pick up from there, and he has a very nice crystal ball there, and he's looking into the future and see how the future of Taiwan should be dealt with in relation to the Taiwan Relations Act, is the Taiwan Relations Act good enough for Taiwan's future, or should it be amended in some fashion? I start thus with Mr. Richard Nixon, President of the United States in the early 70s. At that time, the Kuomintang government, ROC, was still in the United Nations, and there were still diplomatic relations with the United States. There were two considerations why the United States wanted to have better relations with China and wanted to normalize relations with China. That was one, to drive a wedge between the USSR and China. USSR was very threatening. A lot of missiles were aimed at the United States. Second reason was to try to end the Vietnam War, which had been going on for many, many years already and was really grinding down the spirit of people in the United States. There was a lot more opposition. So Nixon felt that by using China, he could influence Vietnam. Whether he succeeded or not, there's a big debate about that. So what happened in the early 70s, Mr. Kissinger went on 2 secret trips to Beijing, July and October 71. And then in October 71, also the United Nations voted to expel the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. So I think that language, that's literally from the resolution 2758 in the United Nations, this formulation. The word Taiwan doesn't even appear in resolution 2758. The resolution 2758 was not about kicking Taiwan out of the UN, but was about who was the legitimate representative of China. So I think that is something that is really has started to mix up in the minds of people. People always say Taiwan was kicked out of the UN. Not the case. Chiang Kai-shek was kicked out of the UN. The United States still tried to do something about that situation, and they tried to have dual representation, have both China and Taiwan in the United Nations, which is basically a very ideal solution, right? Both of them in there. But Chiang Kai-shek didn't want to have anything to do with it. It was proposed to him, but he said, "Niet." So that was, well, not the same language, I guess, but... So a few months later, Mr. Nixon himself went to China. We had the Shanghai Communique, and that was the start of the process to establish diplomatic relations. They expected that within 2 or 3, or certainly before the end of Nixon's first term, there would be diplomatic relations between China and Taiwan, and a reduction of the US military presence in Taiwan. Again, they tried to get China to pressure North Vietnam to end the Vietnam War, but by all accounts that really was not very successful. Vietnam kept on going, and the influence of China in Vietnam was not that great. And you see that a few years later there was even a war between China and Vietnam. Whether the pressure on the US to end the threat, USSR to end the threat is also doubtful, but in any case they did move to the SALT talks. In the Shanghai Communique, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there's one China and that Taiwan is part of China. Very important to emphasize that word acknowledge. That's why it's in a different color. It means I take note of, I see that that is your position, but that was not the United States position. The US position was not that Taiwan was part of China, but that they only said, well, we noticed that the Chinese on both sides say that. There was also an interesting debate at that time whether this all Chinese included the Taiwanese. Actually, the State Department said, well, there are a number of people in Taiwan who don't consider themselves Chinese, but Taiwanese. And what do we do with that? But Kissinger basically swept that off the table and said, well, okay, that's not important. So at that time, the view of the Taiwanese was not taken into account in any fashion. I think that's important, and I'll come back to that later on. Mr. Nixon himself, of course, got into a little bit of problem with Watergate, impeachment hearings in Congress. Vietnam continued to go, and in 1974, Nixon departed 2.5 years before the end of his term. And with that also was the normalization with China, establishment of diplomatic relations was put on hold and did not take as it was intended initially by Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger. Then we got the next president, Gerald Ford. At that time, the situation had changed a little bit, of course. Kuomintang government was out of the United Nations, but they still had relations with the US. Vietnam didn't go too well. The fall of Saigon took place in 1975, and the tension with the Soviet Union continued. So actually this opening to China had not helped very much. That is a very important conclusion that we have to make at this point, that the original intentions of Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Nixon didn't really work out. A couple other things. George Bush Sr. was named liaison in Beijing. He established a number of personal friendships with leaders in Beijing, and that helped his later connections when he became president in 1988. Within 1 year, both Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, and Zhou Enlai passed away, so the whole old generation disappeared, and a new generation, Deng Xiaoping and others, came into power. 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected. At that time, again, Taiwan still had diplomatic relations with the United States. In Taiwan itself, Chiang Ching-kuo had become president, 1977 I think that was. And those two situations still continued. The US was reeling from the fall of Saigon, height of the Cold War with the USSR. But then, about midway through his term, Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter, he felt he bit the same way as Kissinger had done. He felt he could use China against Russia. Brzezinski was from Poland, and he does dislike the Russians with a passion. He just wanted to put more and more pressure on them. So he thought, okay, I'll pick up where Kissinger left off, and I'll start the process of normalization of relations with Beijing. So he went to Beijing, again secretly, and restarted the process. In December 1978, that resulted in the announcement of establishment of diplomatic relations and breaking ties with the ROC. So from then on, the US had shifted recognition of government of China from Taipei to Beijing, but wanted to continue the so-called cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. Here, in this communique, the US also said that they acknowledged, remember the word? The Chinese position that there's but one China and Taiwan is part of China. You see a slight difference there, that the Chinese on both sides of the strait have disappeared, and now it's only the Chinese position. So they basically, again, take no account of the views of the people in Taiwan itself. One interesting thing is here, you see the word unofficial. In the Taiwan Relations Act, there's no mention of the word unofficial at all. But here, in this communique, there is. And that basically relates to an interesting discussion that people always have. Which ones are more important, the three communiques or the Taiwan Relations Act? And we always maintain Taiwan Relations Act is more important because it's the law of the land. It was something that was passed by Congress, signed by the President of the United States. The three communiques were basically just joint communiques between China and the United States at the end of a meeting. So they meet, they have a nice meeting, drink some Muay Thai, and then they have a joint declaration. So that's basically the difference between the Relations Act and the communiques. The Relations Act is much more important. What was the reaction in the United States itself? Of course, there was very strong opposition from the conservatives, Mr. Goldwater, Jesse Helms. They traditionally had good ties with so-called Free China and the Kuomintang government. They didn't really have any links with, well, there wasn't even a DPP at that time, so there was just the beginning of the Deng Ai movement. But the rest of Congress was also very angry because they had not been consulted by the administration. Mr. Brzezinski had just gone off to Beijing, come back, and then in the middle of the night on December 15th, they announced we are going to normalize relations with China. This was really very contradictory to all the requests that had been made by Congress. Congress had said in the Dole Amendment and several other resolutions, Congress should be consulted in the process of normalization. That had not happened. So Congress was actually quite furious. And that led, and I'll get to that in a minute, to the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act a few months later. But Jimmy Carter himself was basically in hot waters at that time because of a totally different situation in the world, the Iran hostage crisis, which really drew him down and eventually resulted in his defeat in the 1980 elections. The Taiwan Relations Act, there was a very early draft by the State Department, which was called the Taiwan Enabling Act, I think it was called. But basically what it did was to decide how the office would be called, which was to remain in Taipei, how foreign service officers would temporarily take leave from the State Department position and then go serve in Taipei, and what name there would be. But nothing about the security and stability in the Taiwan Strait, nothing about the economic and social and cultural well-being of the people of Taiwan. And that is what really the Congress added. And as you see here, Frank Church, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he said when he saw this act from the State Department, totally inadequate, you know, ambiguous in language, and they basically were furious about what was presented to them by the State Department. So they got to work, and with a lot of different people from a lot of different angles. So actually the Taiwan Relations Act had a lot of fathers and mothers, perhaps. Huh? So what did it do? It said termination of governmental relations with the governing authorities, the ROC, but continuation of commercial, cultural, and other relations with the people of Taiwan. So everything else but formal diplomatic relations. All the other relations were maintained. Here you see a very important phrase, peace and stability, and June and both Steve and June will come back to that later. Establishment of ties with the PRC rests upon the expectation that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. And this is really the key, the essence of the Taiwan Relations Act, that the future of Taiwan is to be determined by peaceful means. Later on, actually, some administration people and President Clinton actually added with the assent or consent of the people in Taiwan. That's not in the original Taiwan Relations Act, but that became part of US policy at a later stage. How do we do that? Maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. The phrase here says, any efforts to determine Taiwan's future by other than peaceful means, including boycotts or embargoes, are a threat to peace and security in the Western Pacific and of grave concern to the United States. So that really shows that Congress was really very deeply concerned about the future of stability in the Taiwan Strait. How are they going to do that? Two ways: provide Taiwans with arms of a defensive character and maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force. And June will go into those phrases more deeply later. Then, what I consider a very important phrase also, preservation and enhancement of the human rights of all people in Taiwan are hereby reaffirmed as objectives of the United States. This is quite a statement if you really think about it. The United States government, the United States Congress says, we really care for the human rights of the people in Taiwan. This was 1979, mind you. It was the time when Taiwan was under martial law, where no opposition people was allowed. So this was quite a strong statement, and we'll get into it a little bit later how that was dealt with. Another interesting one is nothing in this chapter in the Taiwan Relations Act may be construed as a basis for supporting the exclusion or expulsion of Taiwan from continued membership of any international financial institution and any other international organization. So here basically said, the US says, well, Taiwan should be in international organizations. And the sorry thing is that this part of the TRA has not really been adhered to, as far as we can see, by the United States. The US government and Congress has gradually drifted away from that, and they now say, well, we support Taiwan membership in international organizations that do not require statehood. That phrase is not in here. So that's actually, this present policy is against the Taiwan Relations Act. If you really are a good lawyer, you can make a big case about that. Then we jump to Ronald Reagan. As I said, 1980-81, there was martial law in Taiwan. The Kaohsiung incident happened in 1979, where a lot of people in the south in Kaohsiung wanted to demonstrate for human rights, and all of the leaders were arrested by the government, and they were told, you are trying to overthrow the government. And they were put in prison, they were mistreated, and they were given very long prison sentences. But that, at the same time, was the start of the democratic movement. The Taiwan movement really took off from there. And many of you, many Taiwanese American groups, people in the United States, really started to become organized at that point in time. Many of the Taiwanese organizations here in the US started in 1980, 81, 82. So I think it's quite a significant event because of that. Looking at the outside world, USSR tension was still going on. Mr. Reagan, in a sense, had the third communique, and this was a communique in which he basically froze military sales to Taiwan and agreed that over time they could be decreased if there was no significant threat to Taiwan. And the 6 assurances I'll go into in a minute. That was basically an afterthought after the August 17th communique became unavoidable. Mr. Reagan asked his staff to set down a number of boundary conditions to be given to Taiwan as an assurance. And here you see those 6. I will not go through them individually, but again, the last one is a very important one. The US will not formally recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. They said that then, and they continue to say it since then. So Taiwan's status is still something to be decided peacefully. Then I go to the issue of human rights. There were 2 fathers of the human rights clause in the Taiwan Relations Act, Senator Clayton Powell over there, and Jim Leach of Iowa. Clayton Powell just passed away in January of this year. Jim Leach is still very much active, and he is actually being mentioned as a possibility for the next US ambassador to Beijing. I don't know if that's going to take place, but he is being mentioned for that position at the present time. So he certainly has a good background vis-a-vis Taiwan. You can say that. There were two others who were very important in the early 80s in terms of support for human rights in Taiwan. Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts and Steve Solaks of New York. And together they were our Gang of Four in Congress. You remember China had its Gang of Four in 76, 77. We had our Gang of Four in Congress in Washington. So over the period of the 80s, from about 80, 81 until 92, the human rights clause in the Taiwan Relations Act was very, very important because these four people that I just mentioned, they raised the issue of human rights in Taiwan time and again. They held hearings in Congress. They introduced resolutions about human rights in Taiwan, and every time there was this referral back to the Taiwan Relations Act Human Rights Clause. Already mentioned the and rest of the people after that. Eventually, all the pressure from within Taiwan, from the overseas Taiwanese community, and from Congress led to relaxation in Taiwan. So it was really those three forces that did it, and that led down in 86, the end of martial law, which had lasted for 30 years. 88, Li Tenghui succeeded Zhang Jingguo and really started to initiate reforms, which then led to the parliamentary elections in 1992, the first election for the legislative. Old enough, you probably still remember that the legislative had all these old people who were 89, 90, or 95 years of age going, and the hand was raised when they had to vote by a nurse, you know, and they voted in the. So at the time, the Relations Human Rights Clause was very important back 25 years ago, 30 years ago. But we feel that it's also very important now, because since the beginning of the Mainjo administration in May 2008, we have seen in a sense an erosion and a decline of democratic principles. The lack of checks and balances in the legislative yuan vis-a-vis the administration. You had the arrest and detention of a number of prominent members of the DPP back in November, December. You had post during the visit of Yindin in November 2008, and the manipulation of the judiciary system by the Ma administration, and some outside observers called it a judicial circus. Basically, that the judiciary was being manipulated by the present former government, and then so the rather blatant use of the media for political purposes. Independent publications would receive information from the judiciary, from the prosecutor's office, and they would publish it. This was confidential information that was not supposed to go. Dictated information time and time again, and organizations like Freedom House, like to protect journalists and others, they have written reports about that, and they have protested that. I talked in a very early stage about Chinese and Taiwanese. That statistics, opinion polls over the past 20 years. And you said, starting from 1991, there was only 20% in opinion polls. Only 20% of the people said when asked, are you Chinese, Taiwanese, or are you involved? I'm Taiwanese. Only 20%. 50% said they China, and about 30% involved. And that has really changed, and this is really a change of difference to about 70% saying they're Taiwanese now, less than 5% say they're only Chinese, and then about the same, about 3% say both. So after the democracy really changed, and that is really so important for the people. So how do you perceive yourself? And, but also how do others perceive you? In a sense, in this country, in the United States, that took place in 1776, when a lot of people still said, I really lead you to the English. In the beginning, people said that, but really you see people saying, oh no, I'm American, I really stand for this country. So in the same way, that has really also happened in Taiwan. And I think that's another important consideration. Country for people of Taiwan and for American government, for the American Congress. Show them this graph time and time again. And I want to close with this little cartoon from the Taipei Times. A lot of people tell Taiwan, change the status quo, don't rock the boat. Kind of peculiar, coming from a country which is built on change. The United States lives by change. And what would have happened with the United States if George Washington had kind of followed this example, don't rock the boat and don't change the status quo? This country have been the same? I believe so. Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to
Last saw Professor Teufel Dreyer in Boston 4 years ago. It was 2005. China had just passed the Anti-Secession Act, and instead of working my thesis, I see on Taiwan, and definitely worth it. Not only knowledgeable and insightful, but also witty. That's why I'm especially excited to be able to introduce her today. With PhD in government and East Asian studies from Harvard, Professor Dreyer has served as the chief for the Library of Congress and the chief of operations. In 2000, she was appointed by the Speaker of the House, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, to study the national security implications of the economic and trade relations between the United States and China. And Master of Political Science at the University of Foreign Research Institute. Professor Dreyer wrote a couple books and countless articles. So please join me in welcoming East Asian foreign affairs expert Professor Teufel Dreyer.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction. And I have the shirt from the Formosan t-shirt that you all gave on that occasion. It's been worn quite a bit, so it doesn't quite look as pretty as it did the day I got it. But lots of people in Miami have seen it. Well, I asked, by the way, he's genuine rocket scientist. He has a PhD in aeronautic sciences. Aerospace science. So I asked to put up these security-related use second out. I'm going to let you read slides rather than go over them. Okay, so there is several references need to maintain peace and security in the Western Pacific, which can be read as a warning not to upset peace, security, and making clear that normal is contingent on the expectation that the future of Taiwan is going to be determined by peaceful means, and so on and so forth. Here, there's the President of the Congress noted Congress appeared several times, and because often the President acted, and the Congress has been hearing about it later. And I can see Daphne, making a face here. She's noticed that too, and that this articles over stole on their judgment of Taiwan, meaning the People's Republic of China does not get a vote. Okay. All right. So that is basically what I wanted you to see. Now, I thought I understood the security provisions of the Taiwan Relations Act, and I bet from this too. And to this equation, last week, Richard Bush, who is a former head of the American Institute in Taiwan, and a very respected one, by the way, I would say one of the most respected ones, by both blues and greens, of all political views in the United States. A very interesting talk about anniversary TRA, in which he said, we don't understand what the Taiwan Relations Act says after all. So I was very intrigued by that. And he says that to make sure that President Carter would sign, the House managers actually changed the original language to make it more ambiguous. And he gave 4 examples, which I'll run through very quickly here. With regard to arms sales, he points out, in U.S. legislative practice, Congress uses the word shall to mean that it will take this action. Okay? But the TRA doesn't say that. It says the United States will make available to Taiwan such defense articles, blah, blah, blah. And according to Richard Bush, shall is more definitive than will. You didn't know that either. Okay. Shall means you have to do it, means you can, at least according to Richard's explanation. And second thing he says is, and this is true, that the TRA has no criteria for determining how the U.S. government should decide Taiwan's equipment needs. Maybe, but that's like somebody asking a Supreme Court justice. He could give a precise definition of pornography. And his answer was, I can't, but I know it when I see it. And so it seems to me that it would be a waste of time to criteria for someone needs more arms because we all know it, see it. Okay. Third point is that the bill seems, meaning the RA, seems to require that the administration take congressional views into account, which it does, as you see here. But then he points out, well, in accordance with law. And according to Richard Bush, this means that the only thing Congress, that the administration is required to do is inform Congress after it's taken an action. Now that's not the way I read it, and that's probably not the way you read it. All right. Finally, he says, the T says, the United States should maintain the capacity to resist Chinese pressure. And he points out there is no commitment in the TRA for the United States to actually use this capacity. We're required to maintain it, but the well, I don't know. This is like saying, I'm required to put a bathtub in my house, but there's no intention for me to ever use it. You know? So what I'd like to point out here is that the intent of making the launch of treaty, any piece of legislation too explicit, is to avoid tying the hands irrevocably of the signatory. Because if you're making a treaty with country X, you don't want to put yourself in the position if country X just decides to do something. You've just allied with Soviet, and Soviet decides to drop an atomic bomb on Britannia. You don't want a treaty to irrevocably put you on the side of defending Slovenia after this act. So all these and most pieces of legislation are with some wiggle room in there. If you don't believe me, sometime for fun, look up the history of Article 9 in the Japanese Constitution. If you read seems to indicate that Japan can never, under any circumstances, have a military and resort to force. So theoretically, they don't have a self-defense, and the third largest nation in Asia. Okay, but it's not a military; it's a self-defense force. You get the idea. All right. So the point is here, we've got some wiggle room, and we've got people pointing out ambiguities in the Taiwan Relations Act, as there are in virtually all acts. And my argument here is, if we agree there's a certain ambivalence in it, then it is our job to push to see that Congress and the executive appoint it, interpret it in the way that we, the people, who are the boss of those guys in the White House, Congress, interpret it the way we want it. That's my major today. And if you look at the various aspects of the ongoing debate about what to sell, what to do to make the People's Republic of China happy, etc., there is a tremendous, I would say, weaning component of domestic U.S. politics. For example, for a whole year after normalization, there were no arms sales at all. That was a deal Jimmy Carter made with Deng Xiaoping. And meanwhile, there's a battle rage within the bureaucracy. Should we want the money or not? The FAPA is saying F-16, an F-16 fighter plane shorter range. And Natalie Northrop, which developed that plane with the idea that there would be a customer of one, was very upset when the union went against it. The issue came up again in 1982, as Garrit has explained, when the Republic of China threatened to withdraw its ambassador unless we signed another communique. And I can remember being in the office of the National Security Advisor at the time, a guy named Greg, hot water over the Iran conflict thing, and Greg's 6'6", and he slumped in his chair, slipping. Kenny, the sky is falling. The sky is falling. We've got to sign this communique, and otherwise they're going to withdraw their ambassador. And I said to him, we don't want an ambassador from the 20-something years, and they're going to recall him for consultation. You think we can't get on without him? No, we've got to do something. So the communique is signed, but then, as Garrit has told you, Reagan says, but we had an understanding that this depends on people relations across, and then he agreed to that, and Reagan said, okay. And he presents Taiwan with the 6 assurance. So you see domestic politics tremendously infringing in here. Reagan has, first of all, Reagan is on the side of Taiwan, but second, Reagan has a lot of public opinion and Congress pushing to do something like this. Now, in 1992, another example, and this is George Bush, number 41, President 41, he announced the sale of F-16 Taiwan. So couldn't the F-20, 20 years before, now they get the F-16, and it would be nice to say, as Bush 41 did say, that the reason was that the Chinese had just bought Sukhoi twins from the Soviet Union, i.e. now Russia. So that's the reason he gave. Now, is that the real reason? No, it was not the real reason. Polls showed Bush is up for re-election in 92. The polls show him running way behind Bill Clinton, California, Texas, which both have states with a large aerospace industry, and aerospace workers they vote in the election. And he figured he was going to have to do something, so he announces the sale. See what I mean? Domestic politics is very, very important here. Okay. Now, the next point was a heavy on American politics. And Clinton deciding to send the 2 aircraft carriers to the area off the Taiwan Strait, not in it, but off it, in 1996, after the PRC has a whole year of war games and missile shootings in Taiwan Strait. Clinton gets credit for this. He shouldn't. What he's doing this for is he was aware that Congress was preparing much drastic action, and so he was trying to undercut that by sending those aircraft carriers down. All right. So now, finally, another politics. George 43 on the hunt, pressing to Taiwan where it took to defend it, and then announcing in April 2001 an impressive list of items that the United States was willing to sell, including the submarines that Taiwan had been trying to buy for 20 years. Now, what's next, of course, domestic arguments out in Taiwan about these weapons sales. Domestic politics are important everywhere. And then there were some sound reasons for this decision within Taiwan. One thing was tag on a lot of these items from us. And in some cases, it was because the weapon was no longer made in the United States anymore. And if you have to reopen a production line on something, it costs a lot of money. Taiwan is a very small island. It does not need for plane, and therefore the unit cost of eating for each is going to be very low. It's the economies of scale coming in. So that is one big problem. A second one is the United States has offered to sell Taiwan diesel electric submarines. The United States doesn't make diesel, so hasn't made them in years. So now you say to yourself, we can figure out how to make diesel electric submarines again. We can, but the Navy is dead set against it. And this is one of these, the way you tell men from boys is the cost of their choice. No incoming officer wants to command a diesel electric submarine. My God, that power. And so, in essence, we have offered to sell Taiwan something we can't offer to sell. And this is in spite of poor Trent. A lot of Senator, a lot of the time, the majority leader of the Senate was Trent Lott so much missed because they would have been made in the boatyards in Pascagoula, Louisiana, which is where he's from. Okay, domestic politics again. Now, so there are furious arguments in Taiwan. You know, losing the Greens, and there's an amazing amount of hypocrisy on here. Leon John, of all people, to a supplemental budget for weapons, when the Kuomintang has been using supplemental budgets for weapons for years and years and years. So, now, unfortunately, all this happened against China in its military spending. The first increase happens in 1989, and it continues unbroken to this day. There was only 1 year in which the Chinese military budget dipped below double digits, and then that's a mere 9% increase. And all this against a backdrop of other countries, because the Soviet is no more. People's defense budgets are going way, way down. There used to be a joke in the Pentagon about people congratulating each other on getting combat ribbons for downside. And it's about that the newly Pentagon was now a quadrigon. Things like that. Okay, so this is a big up, and at first they're just throwing money at things, and then you begin to see the money paying off, and increasingly sophisticated weapon, and in their journals, I have the misfortune of having to read things, developing weapons to kill aircraft carriers of an unnamed, technologically more sophisticated power. Those are not the talking about the United States. So, for us, and they're developing the weapons. Now, if it's interested in this, there is a report to Congress issued every year on the Defense Department's website, and it's www.defenselink.mil. This will take you to it, and it's really interesting reading. Now, about 5 years ago, that report starts saying the military balance is tipping sharply in favor of the People's Republic of China. And meanwhile, Taiwan is not only asking to upgrade, it's spending less on its budget, less because the appropriations are not coming through. You know, Garrit mentioned that as a commissioner of the U.S. Commissioner at the time, and I would get into some pretty with a couple of my fellow commissioners, and they are saying things like, why should I send my sons and my Taiwan when these people in Taiwan want to defend themselves? And that was an argument I couldn't answer. And to them until the cows come home about this is partisan politics, and they say, so what? The net result is the same. My kid goes to war to defend themselves. Really, really cause problems for one in the United States Congress, which is not an entity you want to antagonize. Now, some people thought that after the KMT got a decisive majority in the legislative yuan and also won decisively, this would bickering. And indeed, the Taiwan government did send a weapons request in the last half of 2000. Some of you already know what they asked for. They asked for anti-tank missiles, Apache helicopters, P-3C or Orion anti-harpoon missile, Black Hawk helicopters. And at this point, they then had a PACOM admiral announces that weapons sales had been frozen. So, oh my God, when they put in our request, and the United States is so ticked off. Now, the medical reason for this, people survive because you were told explicitly. Well, George Bush doesn't want any problems with China. I will argue to you that this is BS. Okay? And there will always be some strange bureaucracy long enough for that. At one point, finally get somebody to start protesting the China Sea, because whenever you call them, there are two entities, one on each side of the strait. And somebody says, well, Bush is running for re-election. Rock the boat. Or they will say to you, the United States really needs China's help on North Korea. Don't rock the boat. Or they will say, the United States really needs China to help pull the world out of the global recession. There's always going to be for inaction. We would probably still be sitting in the middle of the River, somebody not decide otherwise. Okay, so now at this point, a very knowledgeable person named Bill Murray, former submarine commander, and knowledgeable guy, fascinating article in the Naval War Culture Review, and it really is fact. And you can get it online. It's free. And he talks about the best way to defend Taiwan. Now, if you want to be remembered for anything you write, students up here, be sure fancy name for it. Murray had a brilliant name for this, and he calls it the port strategy. And so it is that none of these weapons that Taiwan is thinking of buying are really terribly necessary. Some of them are totally unnecessary. What Taiwan should do is harden their dig things, protect the electricity grid, like that. And there's also a wonderful reputation working strategy by a real Taiwanese, also a very bright, knowledgeable guy, and this is Dr. Mei Fuxing, and he says, well, you cannot protect them. You really do need airplanes. Because all digging in the world is not to help if they get to the shore first. You've got to have sea defense. So again, you can find that online. I would urge everybody to look for it who's interested in this. And in fact, things very interesting. Okay, now the administration then approves only half the package of what Taiwan said. You want. Yeah. And somebody in the department is asked, and he too comes up with a memorable phrase. He calls it the Goldilocks strategy. Now, he explains Goldilocks, for those of you who don't, searching your mind since it's been 35 years since we talked about Goldilocks in 3 years. What it really means in practical terms is you don't want to sell so many weapons, the hard strategy, that it upsets China, and it's so soft that China to invade. Now, I would argue this is a violation of Reagan's assurances that he says, the TRA, that the weapons sales should be determined solely by the President and the Congress. PRC doesn't get a vote in this. But I doubt Mr. Red Department actually read these communications. And I really mean that. That's not a joke. Okay. Now, the time we are still getting conflicting signals. On the one hand, we're hearing cross-strait relations have improved. We have cross-strait flights. We have visiting. Even did get help with rocks. That picture of the little old lady with the umbrella, yeah. But in general, the idea is, okay, cross-strait relations have improved. So, how do we want to upset cross-strait relations by buying a lot of arms? And that's the one hand. And on the other hand, see a much tougher strategy in the release a couple of weeks ago of Taiwan's very first quadrennial defense review, the QDR. With me over there, but it's www.mn.gov/QDR, and you can print it out for yourself. Now, some of this actually borrows from the porcupine strategy, and some elsewhere kind of sense of what Mayfield says and what Bill Murray says. So, of course, they want on structures, they want to buffer force and the maritime strategy. Now, thank you. It's your car. This is about 20 degrees colder than I'm used to. That's getting me. I'm coughing every time I got off the plane. But anyway, so the bottom line is that the Relations Act there, despite all the ambiguity, and it has served caveats about it. First, Taiwan got to be clear about what it wants and what Australia intends to pursue. There's nothing wrong with making nice with Beijing, as long as you don't give away the shop. But I don't see this happening now. So you've got on one hand, you've got pandas and cross strait, flag and things like that. And then you've got a very tough QDR. In fact, correspondent, this is Wendell Minnick, who has been in Taiwan years, and I think is a very respected fellow, says he thinks it shows a rift between the Ma administration and the Taiwan administration. By the way, for those of you who have QDR, it also has a vulnerable, Ma insists that Taiwan is the ROC, and so he calls his strategy rock strategy. Isn't that great? Yeah. I wouldn't have voted for him, but that's other thing. All right. To follow on that, the security of Taiwan cannot be sapped by partisan bickering, as has been happening in the past. We have a saying in the United States that party politics stops at the edge. I don't always serve it, but it's far good advice. Now, the second point is that the defense provisions cannot be neglected, as they were most of the past 4 or 5 years. This is not, the TRA is not an execute legislation. It does have holes. It does have ambiguities. But use it or lose it quality to the TRA. And if you are not, you and I, and the rest of us as American citizens, if we are insisting to people for that it be you, you're going to lose it. Because you get the People's Republic of China, and it's are insisting. We've got 3 communiques, and you're not living up to them. And one of the most upsetting parts of the Murray was he said his strategy was in compliance with that 1980 communique, which everybody is not, even the State Department's legal counsel agrees on it. So I don't want us to be in compliance with that 82 communique. Now, again, just my closing sentence here. Depends on how hard and how effectively push to keep Congress focused on Taiwan's needs vis-a-vis all the problems they have to worry about. Yes, getting us out of recession is important. Yes, dealing with Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda and Iraq is important. But you can't get time in the process. Thank you.
We're going to do a quick 10-minute break. So we'll see you back for our last speakers. Just a quick thing. There's actually a donation box here. It's a donation for the FAPA Northern California chapter to help us with our activity promoting Taiwan's democracy and just making sure the public gets to know about it. So whenever you stroll by the front, feel free to make a donation now or at the end of the event. I would ask Eric to please come up and introduce our next speaker. And Eric is both a member of FAPA and Stanford TCS. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Daphne. As you said, my name is Eric. I'm a student here at Stanford, and it is my honor to introduce Mr. Stephen Yates. Mr. Yates, currently a fellow at American Policy, president of the DCA Advisory, a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a board member of Taiwan Business Council, a member of the National Community Relations, sponsor friend of the U.S. Indonesia Society, Mr. Yates also serves on the board of directors of the Hamilton Foundation, a not-for-profit organization focused on expanding markets and developments. Mr. Yates served in the White House Deputy Assistant to the Vice President for National Affairs from April 2001 through September. During his tenure in government, he was deeply involved in the development and execution of U.S. foreign policy priorities in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. He participated in the creation of bilateral relations with Indonesia and India, or sought to complete sensitive relations with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and handled crises ranging from North Korea to Venezuela and Haiti. Mr. Yates provided support to the Vice President and his National Security Advisor for White House and diplomatic meetings, and represented the Office of Vice President in senior agency relations. Mr. Yates received a master's degree in studies from the Johns Hopkins Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. A Maryland native, Mr. Yates graduated summa laude from the University of Maryland at College Park with a bachelor's degree in Chinese studies. From 1980 to 1980, Yates spent in southern Taiwan as a church volunteer, living in Taiwan County, Kaohsiung. He regards his Taiwan life as key in shaping his understanding of Taiwan, his future career. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Yates.
Thank you very much. I have the good family going at the end of two very impressive presentations, but also after refreshments, and weren't ready to sleep yet. Now, ready to relax. 各位爱台湾的朋友，大家好。Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and on a topic that I've given a lot of thought to, and also deep out. I, as other colleagues who have spoken, a strong personal attachment to people from Taiwan, experiences in Taiwan, and watching the ebb and flow of U.S. policy over the years, and at least for me, I think others, a degree of fear that things are receding in terms of American commitment, and it's going to take some work to get people to pay attention to what matters. In recent years, there's been a tremendous focus on the fear of war. And is there anything that we can just do to get out of this problem? We don't have to worry about the threat of a war. And the problem with that kind of thing, one side of the equation doesn't care about being blood. And the only way you can avoid the blood is if you appease or leave. Another form of appeasement, I suppose. And so I think that for the sake of freedom for all of the Chinese people, not just the 23 million people, we have an obligation to engage in conversation. Our leaders need to engage in conversation. And in that regard, I think the Taiwan Relations Act anniversary is a good opportunity to refocus on what America's commitment should be now and why, and is it sustainable going forward in the future. We talk about legislation in the U.S. Congress. We go through exercises where every year they pass a 10-year budget. Now, I was born in the D.C. area, lived my whole life in the D.C. area, and watching exercises go, and I don't understand why they bother doing budgets that go 1 or 2 years, because we do it the next year anyway. They never judge their performance, what they said was going to happen 10 years ago. Well, in that kind of an environment, it's pretty astonishing that any piece of legislation is relevant at all at the time of its passing. If you think about the world was like in 1979, and even give the best intentions and greatest foresight, wisdom, attributes of the lawmakers at the time, who then could have foreseen that the Cold War would end, would be a high-tech revolution, which is relevant to time, war on terror, and the current significant economic crisis. In 1979, projected some kind of strategy that would have been relevant to today's circumstances, I think, based on the way the world looked at the time. Think of what China has gone through, the sustained economic success, and maybe, and also going through a period of the Tiananmen Square massacre, military modernization, absorption of regional investment and manufacturing, including from Taiwan, and throughout all this, a lack of political reform. Think of Taiwan going through this span. Movement to democracy, the fall of Li Denghui, the rise and fall of Arabia, deep economic integration with China, at the time strengthening local identity. Now had another shift going from what the sort of worriers in the international community called moves toward independence to a revival, a common dialogue between the CCP and AMT. I think if we would have taught that in particular years ago, people would have thought, how could this possibly be really relevant? You know, democratized. How could party dialogue be so relevant? Well, guess what? It's back, and in a big way. And so there's been tremendous change, all of it, a tremendous change over a 30-year period, presenting circumstances that I think would have been the wisest of all of our lawmakers. And so in that regard, I think that they owe a great deal of credit, something that has done as well as it has for as long as it has, and really in many ways remain relevant today. But I'm going to focus a little bit on the parts of the glass that are empty, in my view, and the optimism of someone else. Actually, I am a person sometimes, but it's past hour. The Taiwan Relations Act really outlined three primary missions for U.S. policy. Specifically, the Congress's role in overseeing executive branch implementation of the Taiwan Relations Act. First was to deter aggression, in my view. The second was to promote economic freedom. The other was to protect the human rights of Taiwan people. Well, I've already done a little bit of talking about how some of those stands have shifted. I'm going to look specifically at some moves, those specific categories. Think of just the challenge of deterring aggression. The history of A is now longer than the history of the Mutual Defense Treaty. I think that's just an interesting point of perspective. That this legal instrument that is not a treaty has been sort of the foundation for U.S.-Taiwan relations for a longer period than the mutual treaty was. The military dramatically shifted in China's favor, as Professor Dreyer made very clear, and then a growing U.S. sensitivity to China's military in an interesting way that with a profound military modernization, you would get people with a lot of metal on their and on chests to stiffen their backs and be strong enough to push back. But what happened in this way is the stronger China's military modernization becomes, the more timid anyone is to interact with it. Any serious discussion about will they ever push back. We're being tested on that right now in what seems almost theatrical ways, where we have a surveillance ship where you have some lunatic group that's really, it's crazy fox. It's coming up and it's stopping our ship, and they harass them by stripping down to their skin, which I think is harassment. And they're doing serious things to challenge where the U.S. can come and go in the region. And they're demonstrating capabilities that they will much less have to employ against us than we are in return. So I think it's a big challenge. As also been noted over the years is increasingly relying on political and economic its strategy for dealing with that. That's something that I think makes it a challenge. And then the anti-secession law and the PLA developing missions that go beyond Taiwan, in some ways, is a challenge for what we as Americans should be doing to maintain capability to deter aggression itself. In promoting economic freedom, U.S. and Taiwan investment in grown in enormous amounts, especially over the last decade. And it's been intended for profit, but also in some minds it's intended for the expansion of economic freedom. As much as theory is talked about, economic freedom doesn't have an equally weighted political freedom component coming along with it. That makes promoting economic freedom more complicated, I think. Taiwan economic relations were strong, but they're capped at a certain level due to political activities. I think that these are artificial in some ways, and this enters policy in a very direct way when you're talking about ideas like a free trade agreement or whether we have specific trade duties. We tend not to send our most senior officials to Taiwan to solve, but we will send 12 cabinet secretaries, if we had 12 cabinet secretaries, to China, classes and talk about the world, and solve nothing and come home. But to actually solve a problem in Taiwan, send to go to Taiwan to meet with the president and try to solve a problem. I think that this is a profound political that it makes for I think too many unnecessary obstacles in addressing economic relations as well. I'll repeat it a few times, and it's been said before, but it's something that seems to be forgotten when we look back in awe of the progress Taiwan's experienced. Taiwan was not a democracy in 1979. It was still martial law. And when the Taiwan Relations Act was passed, that was the reality. There wasn't kind of forethought about what would happen after democracy. The mission was focused very much on the basic elements of human rights. Could political parties organize? Could people have free speech? These are the lowest standards of democratization and there are some big challenges now in Taiwan's continuing democratic progress, which I'll allude to a little bit more in a moment. Important point is that democracy is more than elections. Democracy, I don't know who coined the phrase, but I'll steal it and claim credit for it. But democracy is not it's an ongoing process. And the moment you stop pushing for progress, you roll backwards. And so, to me, the important point is in the United States, as we look on, and the people of Taiwan, as they look at their democracy, I think in recent years, frankly, a lot of people have gotten in place. Transfer of power in 2000. And this means democracy has arrived. Well, guess what? Part of democracy had arrived. But if you don't push it, and you don't keep working, you don't keep focused on meaningful changes and goals that have to take place, and you don't keep American policymakers understanding why everyone loves to close up and put it back on their shelf. I'm done with that story. I don't need to do. I've got 10 other causes waiting to come into my office and ask for help. You guys are prosperous. What in the world do I need to do something for you now? We've got wars, we've got economic issues. We need to have an answer. And guess what? I think that's harder, not easier now, but still important. When it comes to human rights of the Taiwan people, unsympathetically, but really it is in sympathy, put the greatest burden on people. Their responsibility, make their government responsive to them. is there, and it's responsibility to do what we can to help and to support. But for me, it's not my country. It may be my second home sometimes, my country. It's the job of the Taiwan people to push organizations. But we should not be enabling those who want to take ultimate decisions of their future out of their hands. The core of human rights and progress rests in the question of the assent of the Taiwan people. Garrit mentioned in his presentation, you know, not my favorite president, but Bill Clinton added a very important clause in what we usually say about with issues related to Taiwan, that differences with the mainland had to be resolved peacefully and with the assent of Taiwan. I worked for President for 5 years, and no problem in saying he failed to reiterate that time in office. And until the current president or Secretary of State, also Clinton, restores this, it's as Professor Dreyer was talking about in another context. If you don't use this, it goes away. It's almost as if it was never there. So there really needs to be a push, even what was gained long ago, back to where it needs to be. But this is a sense of Taiwan people, and enabling them to have power to make ultimate decisions about their own future is something that's the responsibility of the international community and American citizens. Now, where we come from in the Taiwan Relations Act, and over most of the last 30 years, there was this element of throwing off more and have actions and democratic progress. But a lot of people, when they think of the Taiwan Relations Act, really think about the military. And you know, I'm not going to diminish that role, because ultimately, kind of power is very important in dealing with major powers like China. But there's a lot to America's opposition that go beyond the military, and the challenges in those areas, I've said, have gotten great. Part of it is we in the United States, as Garrett's presentation mentioned, starting in the Nixon administration, took my former boss used to bet. In the early 70s, if we agree to diplomatically and economically engage the PRC, the power of engagement and the opportunity of that engagement will lead them to develop in ways where differences in our interests will become narrower, and the areas of cooperation that are there for us to pursue will become broader. And also to fundamental change inside of China to where we can have a more normal relationship with them. This is what he would just call bet. Brilliance, capturing all of it. That's all it is, though, is a bet. It's not a guarantee, it's not prophecy, it's a bet. How's that bet looking now? It's been 30 years. Progress should there have been? Our government today talks about areas of cooperation that the United States and China should be having all over. How's that going? Some of our diplomats will say critical cooperation going on in China relations with regard to North Korea. No question in my mind that our have a lot of diplomat, but hasn't changed the fact on the ground in North Korea at all. Really hasn't. You know, I'd love to give people credit where it's due, but in a one-way trajectory North Korea program, and it has defied Republicans, Democrats, people named Bush, and people named Clinton, and I say some of Obama in fate too. Well, so where then do you attach the weight to that cooperation with China? Well, some people a great deal of weight to it. They're still on the bet. And when I look at the bet, I think that there has indeed been important change in China. There's no question a lot of people's livelihoods neighborhoods are a lot better off today than they were 30 years ago. But for heaven's sake, shouldn't they be? I mean, really, if it had been 30 years and where they were then, what would you think of it? We, if you aren't better off today than you were 4 years ago, you want to vote the bums out. Whatever, 30 years, pretty high standard. But even by that, they have done. We should acknowledge that. I think it is natural in this kind of an environment that the United States is going to keep economic with China. The top two. The question is, how do you, in that relationship, how do you deal with the flies come in as dung shell refer to us and open us economically? Well, we have a lot of work to do, and Taiwan has a lot of work to do structurally. If you're going to have a deep economic relationship with China, how to protect your values of your economic system, and how do you balance against